The journey to Bannack was not merely a physical movement across the landscape, but a descent into a world where the fragility of human life was exposed by the ruthless indifference of the elements and the malice of fellow men. In the early years of the gold rush, the territory was a blank space on the map, a void that swallowed the hopeful and the desperate with equal lack of concern. To reach the gold-laden creeks of the Grasshopper Valley, a traveler had to cross hundreds of miles of the most unforgiving terrain in North America. The most common route began in Salt Lake City, which was the last outpost of civilization before the great northern wilderness began. It was a journey that measured roughly 400 miles, but in the 19th century, distance was measured not in miles, but in days and suffering. The road was not a road in the modern sense, but a braided network of rutted tracks cut into the earth by the iron-rimmed wheels of heavy freight wagons and the hooves of countless oxen. It wound its way northward through a landscape of high desert plains where the gray sagebrush stretched to the horizon like a restless and petrified ocean. The wind on these plains was a constant companion, a relentless force that kicked up clouds of alkaline dust that coated the throat and stung the eyes and settled into the very pores of the skin. For the men driving the freight wagons or the solitary riders with their bedrolls tied behind their saddles, the days were an endless cycle of monotony and endurance. The sun beat down with a hammer-like intensity, bleaching the color from the rocks and turning the leather of the reins hot to the touch. Water was scarce and often bitter to the taste, tainted with the minerals of the earth. The animals suffered as much as the men, with their ribs showing through their dusty coats as they plodded forward with heads hung low. The skeleton of a horse or the broken axle of a wagon abandoned by the side of the trail served as grim mile markers, a reminder that not everyone who started this journey lived to finish it. But the physical hardships of the trail were nothing compared to the psychological terror that gripped the travelers as they moved further north into the lawless vacuum of the territory. This was a land without sheriffs or judges or jails. It was a place where a man was only as safe as his aim was true and his luck was good. The road to Bannack quickly earned a reputation as a trail of blood. It was the hunting ground for a breed of men known as road agents. These were not common thieves who acted out of desperation, but organized and predatory criminals who had turned murder into a profession. They knew the terrain better than the freighters. They knew the blind corners in the canyons and the thickets of willows along the river crossings where a man could lie in wait without being seen. They operated with a network of spies in the mining camps and the supply towns who would send word ahead about who was traveling and what they were carrying. The psychological weight of carrying gold was a burden heavier than the metal itself. A miner who had spent months freezing in the creeks of Bannack and who had finally struck it rich faced the terrifying prospect of getting his fortune back to civilization. He would sew the gold dust into the lining of his coat, or hide it in the false bottom of a tool chest, or pack it into hollowed-out logs on his wagon. Every stranger on the road was a potential enemy. A friendly greeting could be a ploy to gauge the weight of a saddlebag. A request for a light for a pipe could be a distraction before a knife was drawn. Paranoia became a survival instinct. Travelers would band together in large groups for protection, circling their wagons at night and setting armed guards who stared into the darkness with fingers resting on the triggers of their rifles. The nights were the hardest part of the journey. When the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks of the Rockies, the temperature plummeted and the silence of the wilderness descended like a heavy blanket. The darkness was absolute. There were no lights from farmhouses or distant towns, only the cold glitter of the stars and the pale wash of the moon. Every sound was amplified. The snap of a dry branch, or the hoot of an owl,
or the rustle of the wind in the dry grass could send a jolt of adrenaline through the camp. The road agents preferred to strike when their victims were vulnerable. Sometimes they would attack a camp at dawn, just as the travelers were waking up and groggy from sleep. Other times they would choose a narrow choke point on the trail, where the wagons had to slow down to navigate through rocks or mud. Imagine the scene of an ambush in one of the lonely canyons that lead to the Beaverhead Valley. The stagecoach, which was the primary means of transport for those who could afford it, would be rattling along the uneven ground. The driver would be scanning the cliffs above, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside the coach, the passengers would sit in tense silence, clutching their carpet bags and avoiding eye contact. Suddenly, a command would ring out from the brush. "Halt!" It was a single word that froze the blood. Before the driver could react, figures would materialize from behind the rocks. They wore long coats to hide their shapes, and their faces were covered with handkerchiefs or masks made from flour sacks with holes cut for the eyes. The road agents were heavily armed, usually carrying double-barreled shotguns, which were the most feared weapons of the close-range fight. A shotgun did not need to be aimed with precision to be lethal. The command was always simple and direct, which was your money or your life. Resistance was usually futile and often fatal. The road agents were not interested in heroism, they were interested in efficiency. If a driver hesitated or if a passenger reached for a pistol, the response was a hail of lead that tore through wood and flesh alike. The robbery itself was a terrifyingly quiet affair after the initial shouting. The passengers would be ordered out of the coach and made to stand in a line with their hands raised while the bandits ransacked their luggage and searched their persons. Watches and rings and wallets and hidden pouches of gold were tossed into a grain sack. The bandits were often polite in a mocking sort of way, tipping their hats to the ladies while stripping them of their jewelry. They knew that fear was their greatest weapon. Once they had what they wanted, they would often disable the coach by cutting the harness of the horses or breaking a wheel, ensuring that they could make their escape long before a pursuit could be organized.
They would vanish back into the wilderness as quickly as they had appeared, leaving their victims shaken and destitute on the side of the road. But not all encounters ended with the victims simply losing their wealth. For the solitary miner returning home with his season of earnings, the road was a death sentence. Many men simply vanished. They would ride out of Bannack with a wave and a smile and never be seen again. Their bodies would be found weeks or months later by another traveler, stumbling upon a gruesome scene in a ravine or a thicket. The wolves and the coyotes and the buzzards were the only witnesses to these lonely murders. The road to Bannack was lined with unmarked graves. Sometimes a traveler would take the time to pile a few stones over a body and perhaps carve a name onto a piece of wooden board if the identity was known. These cairns of stone stood as silent sentinels along the trail, a testament to the violence that permeated the gold rush. One of the most notorious spots on the trail was a place called Robber's Roost. It was an area of dense timber and rocky outcrops that provided perfect cover for the gangs. The very name struck fear into the hearts of the teamsters. Approaching this area, the drivers would whip their horses into a frenzy, trying to pass through the danger zone as quickly as possible.
The dust would choke them, and the wagon would lurch violently, threatening to tip over. But speed was the only defense against the ghosts that haunted the trees. The gang known as the Innocents, which was secretly led by the sheriff, Henry Plummer, was responsible for much of this carnage. They had turned the road into a toll booth of blood. They had a code and a system. They used special marks on rocks or trees to signal to each other, indicating if a stagecoach was guarded or if it carried gold. This level of organization made them nearly impossible to defeat. A man could not fight an enemy he could not see, and he could not trust the law when the law was holding the gun. The isolation of the territory meant that help was always too far away. If a man was shot on the trail, he would likely bleed to death long before a doctor could be found. The road was a test of character. It stripped a man of his pretenses and revealed his true nature. Some men crumbled under the pressure, turning back to the safety of the settlements. Others became hardened, their eyes constantly moving, their hands never far from their holsters. The arrival in Bannack after surviving the journey was a moment of profound relief, but it was a relief tinged with the trauma of the road. As the wagons crested the final hill and the smoke of the town came into view, the travelers would let out a breath they felt they had been holding for weeks.
They had run the gauntlet. They had gambled their lives against the road, and they had won. But even in the safety of the town, the memory of the journey lingered. In the saloons, men would speak in hushed tones about the fresh graves they had passed, or the suspicious riders they had seen on the ridge. The stories of the road became the folklore of the territory. Every miner had a story of a close call, or a friend who had not made it. The road to Bannack was more than just a transportation route. It was a physical manifestation of the risk and reward calculation that defined the American West. It proved that the gold was not free. It was paid for with sweat and fear and blood. The road remains today, though it is now paved and traveled by tourists in comfortable cars who look out at the sagebrush and see only beauty. But if one listens closely to the wind that still blows across the high plains, one might hear the creak of the wagon wheels and the crack of the shotgun and the silent prayers of the men who traveled the trail of ambush and death. The land remembers what the history books often forget. It remembers that civilization was built on a foundation laid by those who dared to walk the road when it was nothing but a scar on the face of the wilderness. The dust of the journey finally settled, but the silence of Bannack hid a danger far greater than the open road. For here, the law itself was a lie, and the devil was waiting behind a silver star.